So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Segfrey Gonzales. I'm a Master's of Science, Social Science student here at AUT. So I'm here to present my master's thesis. It's a work in progress. So it's titled The Logics of Violence in the Bangsamoro Conflict, Philippines. So for my general purpose is just to share what I'm working on for my master's thesis. So basically, I'm working on a quantitative analysis of the environmental factors that influence the frequency of violent incidences in the context of the Bangsamoro conflict in southern Philippines. In this presentation, I will present my literature review, my research method, and some information about the Bangsamoro conflict. Given that I'm still collecting the data for my quantitative analysis, I will present the expected outcome of my research based on relevant studies to the topic. So let me begin my presentation with a brief story. So Mindanao is one of the three major islands in the Philippines, resting in the southern portion. It's considered the food basket of the country, considering that 8 out of the top 10 agri-commodities exports of the country comes from Mindanao. Given its rich tourism, cultural, and natural resource potential, it has gained the moniker the Philippines Land of Promise. However, in the western side of the Land of Promise, there is a region afflicted with violent conflict. At the same time, this region suffered decades of political and economic neglect, as evident on its lagging economic performance relative to the other regions of the country. So the region is also home to the ethnic groups which collectively identify themselves with the term Moro, which refers to the Muslim, non-Hispanicized, and non-subjugated inhabitants of the Philippine Southern Islands. The Bangsamoro, or the Moro nation, triumphantly resisted Spanish colonization and steadfastly struggled to maintain their independent status as a nation during the American colonization. Once the Moro reigned over the Land of Promise. In fact, there was 3 Moro for every 1 non-Moro in Mindanao in the 1900s. However, at the turn of the century, the ratio was reversed. This was due to oppressive national integration policies such as state-sponsored large-scale Christian migration to the Muslim South and economic exploitation of Mindanao by external actors. These were promoted during the Spanish colonization, the American colonization, and until the new Philippine sovereign state. Throughout the American colonization, the Bangsamoros' struggle for independence were generally peaceable. They mostly rely on the limited political channels available to them. However, the decades of violence to follow is said to be triggered by the Jabida massacre in 1969, where 28 Muslim military trainees were summarily executed. Currently, the Bangsamoro conflict has 5 political groups. One is the Philippine government. The other 4 are the Moro National Liberation Front, Moro Islamic Liberation Front, Abu Sayyaf Group, and the Bangsamoro Islamist Freedom Fighters. I would focus on these 4 political groups, given that they constitute the one hand of the conflict, the other hand being the Philippine government. And these groups were preceded by the Muslim Independence Movement and Bangsamoro Liberation Organization, which were created in the aftermath of the Jabida massacre, but eventually they became inactive. So these political groups are generally offshoots of the older ones, resulting from the dissatisfaction from the peace agreement brokered between the Philippine government and their predecessors. For example, the MILF continued their separatist struggle when the MNLF had a peace agreement with the Philippine government in 1991. The same happened with the MILF and BIFF in 2013. The Abu Sayyaf group, on the other hand, is considered a terrorist organization with alleged links to international terrorist group Jemaah Islamiyah. So the vertical conflicts refer to clashes between the political groups and the state and its institutions, while horizontal conflict refers to the clashes between these political groups, political parties, and private armed groups. There were as many vertical conflicts as horizontal conflicts in the past 4 years, but there was a surge in vertical conflicts in 2014. So the people of Mindanao has suffered the impacts of the violent conflict at a cost of 120,000 dead in 30 years, and 2 million people internally displaced. In the last 4 years, from 2011 to 2015, 7,972 victims were claimed by the conflict. A portion of them were kidnapped or trafficked, but most of them were injured or killed. If one considers the people who have lost their livelihoods, the people who were internally displaced, and the people who experienced psychological trauma due to the conflict, this is a blunt underestimation of the cause of conflict. These estimates, rough as they may be, is enough warrant for a serious study of the problem with the sole purpose of finding solutions. So this is the focus of my research. On screen, you would see a bar chart with the horizontal axis representing the 119 municipalities constituting the 5 provinces of the Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao. The vertical axis show the number of reported violent incidents from 2011 to 2015. As you can see, the municipalities are scattered all over the chart with a mean of 38 and standard deviation of 75. This means that there is a large variation among the observation as seen in the chart. So my focus is to make sense of this chart in terms of explaining the variations among the administrative regions. In particular, I want to identify characteristics of the municipalities which may predict municipalities with less violence and municipalities with more violence. From my findings, I will offer my personal recommendations. So, within the context of the Bangsamoro, many forms of violence are perpetrated by the political groups. As you can see from the horizontal bar chart, the MNLF, MALF, BIFF, and ASG, although they're mainly in clash with the Philippine government, also perpetrate other forms of violence through their illicit activities like kidnapping, ambuscade, shooting. The Civil War literature where I sourced most of my theories and concepts generally consider this forms of violence as analytically negligible because they're mainly based on findings from country comparative study. So for a subnational scale study such as my research, I argue the otherwise. My research focuses on the analysis on violence perpetrated during a civil conflict where political actors shift from one form of violence to another. Given this continuum of violence, we must analyze these other forms of violence together with the traditional conceptualizations of civil conflict. The key is to establish the anti-system character of these other forms of violence, given that they are not directed at the state. So, civil war has been characterized and distinguished by its anti-system character, which translate to direct attacks against the state and its institutions. Such a notion harks back to Plato, who once said that civil war happens when ruling becomes a thing fought over. Given this context, I established the anti-system character of this minor form of political violence by using Max Weber's monopoly of violence as a defining character of the state. Within this framework, the illegitimate form of violence are not really considered anti-system unless they are motivated by desires to establish a parallel source of rule. So in this context, the political groups, based on their political objectives of political independence from the Philippines, are separated from a political organized crime syndicates which generally commit the same forms of violence. So having explained the phenomenon that I want to make sense of, I'm moving to the explanatory side of my research. So empirical studies recognize that the strength of the organized armed group and the attending intensity of violent conflict depends on the level of popular support. In this regard, I look into the different disciplines within the social sciences to find insights on what makes people participate in communal violence. Sociology, anthropology, psychology mainly accounts for the group and individual processes involved in the people's decision to participate in violence, while political science and economics provide the environmental factors of conflict. So, the greed argument is based on rational choice theory, which stresses on the actor's desire for self-enrichment and their calculation of costs and benefits in engaging in communal violence. Violence, along with peace, is just one of the possible actions for maximizing material gains, which is chosen when the benefits outweigh the costs. So in this regard, violent conflicts are more likely to occur in the presence of profitable opportunities for seizing the territory's natural resources, or when there is a weak constraint for rebellion. For example, if there is a weak police force in the area. To test these assumptions, I'm actually comparing all at once the municipalities having conflicts from 1 to 591 in terms of their political and economic characteristics using a statistical model. In particular, I'm going to use multiple regression analysis, which identifies the relationship between an explanatory variable and an explained variable. So I'm looking at, I'm just presenting a few of my data that I'm looking at. So for under the greed argument, the presence of mineral resources suggests profitable opportunities for illicit economic activities. Hence, it has a positive relationship with the frequency of violence. Per capita income suggests, low per capita income suggests low cost of foregoing legal economic activities in favor of illicit ones. So it has a negative relationship with frequency of violence, while the forest cover in mountainous terrain provides a favorable physical environment for violent conflict. On the given side, I'm sorry? Yep. On the given side, I'm basically looking at some governance aspects, which is based in social contract theory, which argues that, which stresses the failure of the state to uphold every citizen's right and a well-being in return for their submission to the state as a legitimate authority. So given this, if the performance of the state is not that good in terms of ensuring the well-being and rights of the citizens, there is a rationale for an anti-system movement. So I'm gonna measure this based on good governance index and access of the population to basic services, which generally give us a sense of how the local government is performing, while per capita income relative to the nationwide municipal average looks into the inequality experienced by the inhabitants of these territories relative to the other municipalities in the country. So some of the scholars suggest that the Bangsamoro conflict is interreligious conflict that flows from the Muslim versus Christian polarization. This essentialist view of conflict in terms of collective identity may explain the onset of the Bangsamoro conflict in terms of mobilizing the people, but it cannot explain the continued perpetration of violence until now.
We don't have time to discuss it?
Yep. I'm sorry.
Is it okay?
Yep.
We only have 1 minute.
Yep. I'll make it fast.
We have more discussion? No. We only have time 1 minute now. Do you still more discussion, or do you want to finish presentation?
I'll just finish my presentation. Yep. So basically, there are qualitative studies suggesting that religion and ideology are not any more significant in terms of explaining the Bangsamoro conflict. On the other hand, political and economic factors is increasing prominence in terms of explaining the conflict. This is actually confirmed by this data. As you can see, political causes of violence and illegal economic activities are much more greater compared to identity-based causes of violence. So, yep. So this is the significance. Yeah, I understand. Sorry. Thank you.